Back at it again with reflection number 2 on Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. Let's jump in. Here is a chart showing the growth of cities across human history. And you can read the chart from left to right. Right? Jericho and Katahoyuk were two ancient towns. Right? Here we are about 5,000 years ago. The ancient Egyptian empire had just under 1 million inhabitants across the entire empire. Then we come here to the Akkadian Empire, aka Mesopotamia. This was the empire that housed the cities like Babylon and Sumeria. The entire Akkadian Empire had about 1 million inhabitants. Then, about the time that Christ was born, the capital of China had about 1 million inhabitants. Here we have the capital of the Roman Empire, Rome. I thought it had more people in it, but Rome had about 300,000, 400,000 inhabitants in 1100 AD, if I'm not mistaken. Here are some more cities, right? And then we can see here in the last 200 years that city sizes have exploded, right? Right? Exponential growth. So one modern day city houses more people than all of the ancient cities combined. Here is a cool bubble map animation that is showing the same chart. So enjoy. Right? Jericho, about 10,000 years ago, was a small town. Only about 500 to 1,000 people lived in it. Then we had Katahoyuk in Turkey. That was a small town. About 10,000 people lived there. The entire Egyptian empire, about 5,000 years ago, housed under 1 million people, just under 1 million people across the entire empire. The Akkadian Empire, right, about 4,000 years ago, across the entire empire, there were 1 million inhabitants. The Qin dynasty in China, right, its capital, had about 1 million people. The capital of the Roman Empire, Rome, in 110 AD, had about 300,000 inhabitants. Baghdad in 1100 AD had about 1 million people living in that city. Cusco was the capital of the Incan Empire. It was a pre-Columbian empire that got decimated when the Spanish colonial forces moved in on South America. Beijing in 1500 AD had about 500,000 people. Now here we are in the last 200 years, London had about 5 million inhabitants. New York City, right, 1950 had about 8 million people living in that city. And then in the year 2000, Tokyo had about 15 million people, I think. So here is a bubble map showing the relative sizes of these big cities across human history. And you can see that one modern day city has more people living in it than all of the ancient cities combined. So exponential growth in the past 200 years as far as city sizes are concerned. Here is a little storyline showing the history of agricultural production. So humans first domesticated dogs about 30,000 years ago. And we've been smoking weed for about 15,000 years, 15,000 years. We domesticated cows about 12,000 years ago. Then about 10,000 years ago, we domesticated wheat. Supposedly, the earliest cities were formed around wheat cultivation, right? First towns and cities formed around the bread wheat industry. Shortly thereafter, we domesticated goats and pigs, right? 8,000 BC, we domesticated chickens and peas and lentils for the vegetarians. About 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, we domesticated olive trees. 5,000 years ago, the OG car, horses, were domesticated by humans. And we've been drinking wine for about 5,000 years. All right. And most of the agricultural staples that we enjoy today are the same ones we've been enjoying for the past 5,000 years. There's been a few additions to our core diet, but human civilization has pretty much been fed on the same staples for the past 4,000 or 5,000 years. And I will continue reflecting on Sapiens in the next video to keep this short and sweet.